At events like this, it's often the case that people say to myself, I'm sure Anand has the same experience, crises are always great for people in think tanks. The poor suffering officials, they just think they've solved one problem and another one comes and hits them in the face. But for think tankers, it's always Christmas because there's always something new coming along, and there's some truth in that. But one of the things that really struck me about today was the way in which so many senior officials took part actively, and clearly also had a real intellectual engagement, and almost, I'm not quite sure enjoyment's quite the right word, but nevertheless a real engagement on the issues. And I thought it was really striking. At the end, we actually had a senior cabinet office official inviting us to reflect on realism and constructivism, terms which none of our academics, because they all wanted to be very practical and policy-oriented, dare to do. So thank you for that, Simon. I'll give you the real answer after we finish. Can I really thank the organisers? I personally played no role in the organisation of this marvellous event, but the fact we've had such a great agenda, such lively panels, is thanks entirely to my RUSI colleagues and UK and Changing World colleagues. So can I thank in particular Juliana from RUSI. Juliana, where are you? At the back. And Martha from UK and a Changing World. Martha? And of course to Jonathan and Anand for taking all the glory. We started off with a great scene-setting essay from Laurie Friedman, which I look forward to seeing when it comes out in print form. There were so many rich ideas in there. I don't think we could all capture them all as they came through to us. And he started by urging us to be careful, to be realistic about our international position and avoid self-flattery, and a very important starting. And then I think he made perhaps one of the most interesting points in his presentation when he said that for all our focus on what Brexit may or may not mean for the UK's role in the world, the most significant change impacting on our security during this period, it may well be the shift in American policy, certainly emphasized, made so vivid by President Trump, but perhaps arguably a longer term change. And that, I think, framed quite a lot of the discussion, particularly in the morning for me. And I think he had this, I think, really fascinating concept, which other speakers then interrogated later on, about the extent to which the US-UK relationship has relied on grand projects. That for all the disagreements in particular policies since World War II, we've shared grand projects in World War II, in the Cold War, and indeed in the doctrine of the international community, which in a way was another grand project shared by the US and the UK in the post-Cold War period. But it's far from clear that we share a grand project going forward, certainly if the US's grand project is a containment of China, since it's not clear that that's yet a shared priority. But we also addressed, I think, what might be grand narratives, at least for the UK, and I got a sense, certainly personal view, that we interrogated, we knocked around some ideas of what the UK grand narrative will be for this review, but we never quite fixed on something. And of course, our officials made a really good fist of explaining what their current ministers have been saying over the next couple of weeks. But perhaps not everybody was entirely convinced, particularly when that grand narrative was a fulsome support for free trade, and some question the extent to which a free trade narrative fits in a world where not only the UK is leaving the European Union, but also the United States is moving away from that itself. And I think for a while during the day, I felt maybe we were not focusing enough on Europe. But Tom Tugendhat, I think, reminded us rather dramatically right at the beginning of his presentation about the result of the Irish election, and indeed dramatic political developments in Germany. And since we started this discussion today, of course, the person whom we all assumed would be the next German Chancellor has resigned from the leadership of the German CDU. And German politics may be about to become pretty dramatic as well. So that's a very useful reminder. And then we ended up, of course, with Sir Julian King, really bring us right back to the nitty-gritty of the negotiations that we're going to be conducting over the next period about the EU, and reminded us how much the EU is a security actor with a strong sense of deterrence, particularly in non-military areas, and how the UK in the world, in security terms as well as trading terms, is going to have to reckon with its relationship with the EU going forward. And so much of our security continues to depend on our European neighbours. So it's been a fascinating day. All the thoughts from it are still buzzing around my head. I hope you've all found it as useful as I have. For final remarks, can I turn to my good friend Anand Menon? Anand.
Well, Malcolm's pretty much said everything I was going to say, which is slightly upsetting. But I suppose let me just leave you then, because I was going to do the thanks, which have been done, with my three main reflections from today. I mean, the first, which stems from Laurie, I suppose, are we live in a world that is changing quite quickly and changing in ways that are potentially quite dangerous. And at the same time, of course, the West is changing. It's not just the Trump administration, but for those of you who saw the Pew poll that came out this morning, attitudes towards NATO itself within Europe are changing, and many of them, those attitudes are going in what I would call the wrong direction. And yet, when you come to the subject of Brexit, what it seems to me is that neither side, while both sides, the European Union and the United Kingdom, are wrestling to understand those changes and to come up with responses to them, neither side has particularly well clocked the fact that part of the response is bilateral between them. Neither side seems to have fully grasped the fact that to confront those changes, they're better off working together than they are working individually. And yet, on the UK side, we see this continual take-it-or-leave-it approach to all of the negotiations, but that includes security. And on the EU side, we see this utterly bizarre characterisation of the United Kingdom as a third country like any other, which in security terms, at least, we quite palpably are not. Which brings me to my final remark that draws on what Julian says, which is we should not underestimate the dangers of this going wrong. I mean, it would be a monumental failure of politics and diplomacy if this security relationship is undermined by fish. But it seems to me perfectly plausible that it might be. And just think about what that means for a minute. I mean, the absurdity of such a small economic sector derailing such a profoundly broad and deep security relationship in the first place. But I think more to the fact, if you think about what happens if Britain leaves the European Union without a deal, we don't end up with anything signed and sealed by the end of the year. And we end up in circumstances where the government here blames the European Union for this, and governments on the other side of the channel blame this government. The notion that we can quite happily sit next to each other in NATO and collaborate as if nothing had gone wrong strikes me as entirely fanciful. And of all the moments in the recent past where we risked that sort of outcome, this strikes me as the worst, which is a cheerful note on which to end the day, I think. Maybe we should go off and have a drink. Thank you very much indeed.